Yes, it's time for The World This Week, 7 days, 4 Paris-based correspondents, 1 hour. With us, journalist Peter GUMBEL, his latest book, France Has Got Talent. Thank you for being with us. Also joining us, Gianni Carta, Paris correspondent for Brazilian weekly Carta Capital. There's a Brazilian flavor today. We have also with us Cintia CARDOSO of the Brazilian service of sister station Radio France International, and Franco-Syrian photojournalist Anmar ABD RABBO. Welcome back.
Thank you.
The World This Week, where you can join the conversation, and you have on Facebook and Twitter our hashtag TWTW. We start with Ukraine. Last week at the same time, there was still hope that a joint statement out of Geneva would tone it all down a bit. Instead, new flashpoints emerging and bloodshed. A pro-Kiev city councilman, for instance, winding up dead in a swamp. And we've all gotten to know Vyacheslav Ponomaryov. He's gone from manager of a factory that brews soap out of poultry fat to self-proclaimed mayor of the flashpoint city of Slovyansk.
There's an old law that says the minority must submit to the majority. We're ready to repulse any attack. We'll never cede an inch of our territory to the invader.
Peter GUMBEL, we're also getting word, by the way, that 7 OSCE observers have been detained by the aforementioned self-proclaimed mayor, accusing one of them of being a pro-Kiev spy. What does Kiev do?
It's not so much what Kiev does, it's what everybody else does. And I think one of the real issues here is the West's reaction has been completely inappropriate under the circumstances. We've seen in Washington the threat of tougher sanctions, but it's not clear whether they're going to bite at all. And it's almost as though Obama's saying, you know, if you don't stop them right now, I'm going to have a conference call with the European Union. So it's a very weak response to a very critical situation. We're now very close to falling into almost sleepwalking into a civil war. And it seems to me that what needs to happen is you need to get Russia again back on. This is what the Germans are trying to do: get Russia back engaged, get the Ukrainians engaged, get the European Union and the US together, and try and figure out something more than just a short-term stopgap solution.
The Germans who weren't in the room when there was that quartet last week in Geneva.
Which is a stupid mistake, because the Germans have the most to influence potentially on Russia because of the trade ties, because of the personal connections, including between Merkel and Putin. And the Germans who have long memories, remembering when Gorbachev essentially said to the Germans, you can reunify under condition that NATO doesn't encroach further east. And the Germans remembering that there was that vague idea at the time, and of course it hasn't happened. There's 12 new members of NATO. So the Russians feeling besieged by NATO is based not on Putin fantasy, but on certainly some reality there too. So it seems to me that what needs to happen is a major diplomatic attempt to de-escalate the situation and get away from the Cold War rhetoric, which unfortunately has completely taken over the conversation.
De-escalate, but is it de-escalation if we're talking about more sanctions, Gianni Carta?
I don't think sanctions really work, as we have seen. You know, there was a meeting last week on the 17th, on Thursday, the 17th. And nothing happened. After the Vice President Biden, American Vice President Biden, visited Kiev, and before him, John Brennan, the CIA director, had a secret visit in Kiev. They decided to have a second anti-terrorist attack, the Ukrainian army, and the question here is, who killed Rybak, the counselor that you mentioned, in the eastern part of the Ukraine? Well, the eastern people are saying that, leaders are saying that obviously it was some sort of fascist group, like the direct, what is it called, the direct, there are some fascist groups that they say, allegedly they're fascist groups, that attacked, sent 800 men to invade with the Ukrainian army.
Right. And our correspondent hasn't seen him yet. But
they were responsible to, for the killing of this counselor. So this is very complicated. But I think what you said about NATO is a very important issue, because NATO, here you have a president who's a dictator, obviously, was prime minister in Russia. I'm talking about Putin. Twice he was prime minister. Twice he's serving his second mandate as a president. The situation is very confusing.
Right.
We don't know what to expect. This is probably the most confusing situation along with Syria.
As confusing as Syria, Anmar ABD RABBO?
I don't know if it's as confusing, but it's the scheme, let's say, or the decor is quite similar. I mean, with the problem that we just heard, that the Western countries are talking a lot, but doing very little. So at the end, Putin, who is engaged in Ukraine and in Syria, has the feeling that he can do almost anything. Nobody's going to stop him. Nobody can stop him. Maybe it's a different issue. But if we cannot, maybe we shouldn't talk and give hopes to these people who are looking towards the West and who are expecting things to happen, and nothing is happening. So it's a highway to more problems.
All right. And you were saying earlier about the Germans. There was the German foreign minister and his Russian counterpart on the phone this Friday. Sergei Lavrov coming back, though, with some strong rhetoric about protecting minorities in eastern Ukraine. Britain's satirical weekly Private Eye proving perhaps prescient with a caption this week that reads, "We want you to move your border away from our troops." And you see there Vladimir Putin in that satirical weekly. On Thursday, the Russian president insisted he'd defend ethnic Russians in Ukraine and warned Kiev had no right to disarm separatists in the east of the country.
First of all, they do not have a nationwide mandate. In the best-case scenario, they only have some elements of legitimacy, and then only in parliament. All the other legitimate authorities have, for one reason or another, turned out to be illegitimate. This is not an acute phase of confrontation. It's more of a sort of counterinsurgency operation. It will have consequences, undoubtedly, for the decision makers and for relations between our states. We'll see how the situation develops, and we'll draw conclusions based on the realities of the situation.
Cintia Cardoso, what do you expect to happen now when you hear those words?
I think as long as there will be so much hesitation from the part of the international community, I think Putin is going stronger and stronger because nobody really seems to be able to react to his threats. And besides, I also believe that people really underestimated Putin's ambitions or Putin's willing to be a major actor in international scene right now. So I think as long as hesitation will persist, we're not going to see much more exit.
Did we underestimate Putin's ambitions, or did we overestimate Obama's ambitions?
Yeah, both actually.
Because maybe we were all expecting so much from this president, and at the end...
And also Obama, maybe he was expecting so much as well as his partners, thinking that Russia was really willing to play the game as a democratic actor, and maybe he was, and most of other leaders as well, surprised.
I think you also have to look at it from a Russian perspective, in that Ukraine is definitely the Russian backyard. Not only is the Russian backyard, if you go back in history,
exactly.
It's the root of Russia, the Kievan Rus, with the 9th, 10th century foundations of Russia and Belarus and Ukraine are the same, culturally, linguistically. And so at the same time, the proximity, there's a strategic interest, there's a huge interest because there are 20% of the population of Ukraine is actually Russians ethnically. So in terms of taking that into account, I think that's important. You can completely criticize what Putin's doing, but you can't deny that there is a legitimate Russian interest in what happens in Ukraine.
Cultural and historical ties.
I think that's a very, very valid argument, especially in the case of Crimea. They have their fleet there in Sevastopol. They had a referendum. 97% of the people voted. I mean, first, of course, they took it by force, Crimea. But then 90% of the people in a referendum voted for leaving the Ukraine and being part of Russia. So, you have to consider that. But regarding the Ukraine as a whole, if we don't talk about Crimea, it's a very divided country. I mean, I know this is a cliche to say the West is different from the East, but it is. The East, the North, and the South of the East, they're three-fourths of the people, they speak Russian as their first language, as their native language. So this is why you're right about what you're saying. And west of Kiev, they used to belong to Poland. So, this is, they speak Ukrainian, whereas the other ones speak Russian. There's a difference in religion. There are many differences here.
Right, but there's differences.
It's a fragile country.
We're noticing, though, that public opinion is more divided in the East than it is in Crimea.
Right.
For sure.
Definitely.
I want to just bring back one point. You were saying how Russia's not feeling the pain, but what have we seen in the last week? Growth rates once again revised downwards. This Thursday, a rating agency downgrading Russia's creditworthiness to one notch above junk bond status. The Bank of Russia with another interest rate hike to ward off a collapse of the ruble. Russia is feeling the pinch. The question I would put to you, Peter Gumbel, is how much is Russia willing to suffer?
Well, this is short-term financial markets pressure, definitely. And if there's going to be a slowdown of international investment, obviously that's going to hurt. If there's going to be some sort of...
And there's huge outflows of money coming out of Russia.
But there's been huge outflows of money coming out of Russia and going through Cyprus and coming back in again. I mean, this is not something that's new. We've had up and down for the last 25 years. The real question is longer term, how serious an impact is this going to have. As long as you have the price of oil where it is, Russia's economy is going to be fine. And gas, obviously. And so the real question is, in the short term, are the sanctions more than just a little sort of mosquito bite on Putin's elbow? And I think the answer is no, they won't be, because the United States is saying we need more sanctions. Biden was saying it's going to cost, or Kerry's going to say it's going to cost you. But the United States has a very small trade, relatively speaking, with Russia, whereas Europe has a very large trade, 200 billion euros worth of exports, of which Germany provides the bulk. And the Germans are not going to cut off their nose to spite their face over Russia. And Mrs. Merkel is playing it quite cleverly. She's saying, naughty Putin, but she's also not saying we have to stop the trade.
May I say something? I don't think that this is, we're going back to the Cold War for two reasons. First, there's no ideology involved here. And, Putin is not
There's no ideology involved, but there are troops amassed on the border. There was the U.S. this week putting, albeit a symbolic contingent, in Poland.
Yes, but Putin is not using...
People in places like Transnistria are worried.
Like Stalin, like his predecessors. He's not using communism as a weapon, as a reason for invading, if he will invade. And secondly, they are, whether they're democracy or not, and that's a different debate, they are a pro-market country. They have a stock market. We're talking about that now. So I don't think it is a Cold War. I think it's here we're talking about a civil war, and that's why I compared it to Syria. And that's
I don't think they're yet at a civil war, and I think this is why it's such a critical moment. It's that there is a danger that they will walk into a civil war unwillingly and unwittingly, and they're not quite there yet. And I think this is why it's so important that the West takes a much more constructive role and stops the Cold War rhetoric.
So what do they do then? What do they do?
Well, the Germans were saying we've got to take Putin and take him off down to Slavyansk, or take him to Kiev, and we've got to sit down and hammer out with the Ukrainians some sort of a system which is mutually acceptable. And I think that is obviously some sort of a federalized Ukraine with a large degree of autonomy for the different regions, with clear respect.
Which Kiev said last week when they signed on to that document that they agreed to.
Right, but it hasn't gone the whole way. And I think that what they need to do is they need to have very clear protection for the Russian speakers, because that's I mean, this all started after, obviously, what happened in Kiev and Yanukovych going and so on. It started with the new government coming in and immediately saying, we're going to abolish Russian as an official language. And of course, the Russians got really upset about that. It's normal. It's like saying to the Alsatians, you can't speak German, whatever it is. It's just the same idea has to be central to a solution, which is the Russian minority is safeguarded. There is a large degree of autonomy, and you get everybody to sign off on that. That seems to me the most obvious way to resolve this situation.
Yeah, they have to put everything at the table, and of course, taking into consideration this cultural and historical questions as well.
One final point on that. Was it a mistake last Thursday, that final draft document that they came out with in Geneva? No mention is made of Crimea. So in other words, the West accepts that Crimea is gone.
It's
over.
gone, yes.
Was that the only thing possible at that point?
I'm not sure it's the only thing possible or the only mistake. What is clear is that all these issues, the more we wait and the more we do nothing, they get bigger and bigger, and it's a catastrophe later. I'm not sure it's not like Cold War, because of course they're not talking about communism, but there's a huge patriotism that Putin is waving, and that's a kind of ideology also. It's while in the West, I mean in Europe, we try to build Europe by leaving these patriotism that are fighting against it.
Like in Yugoslavia.
But yeah, it's similar to what happened in Yugoslavia or to Kosovo or problems like this.
When we come back, we're going to look at other parts of the globe that have been in the news this week. We'll be taking you to Iran, Brazil, which is preparing for the World Cup, albeit with some bumpy experiences. There was some violence this week in Rio. And we'll also talk about the rock star economist that's turning heads in America. But even though he's French, not making the headlines here. We'll find out why. Stay with us.
Reporters. 3 years after the conflict began, life in Jordan's refugee camps has become a living hell for young Syrian women. The saddest outcome is that these young women can become a commodity for their families. Some are forced into marriage, others are made to work as prostitutes. As cut-price brides or sex slaves with no legal redress, they are entirely at the mercy of their male keepers. Our reporter went underground in the land of bargain bride tourism. He met some of the victims who described their nightmare.
Reporters on France 24 and France24.com.